Dr. Wiedenfeld here to cover cinema in a number of countries that have major industries in the East and South, as well as highlighting some key films. So it's a world war, so the same theme of reconstruction is applying. Another important theme, though, in the global South in particular is political independence. There's this movement of decolonization that happens after the war. Now, this can also be called a new kind of colonialism that's just economic, and that there's it's political independence. But nonetheless, that political independence is very important for cinema. That economic, continued economic kind of imperialism is seen in the dominance of Hollywood abroad. But modernization is going to go along with it. Cinema being an urban phenomenon, towns and cities where people live close together, they're going to the movies. TV is not a big thing yet, but as the cities grow, cinema is growing with them. Let's start in Japan. Japan, let's go back, you may remember, had very important industry in the 20s and 30s and 40s. In fact, maybe the most productive industry in the world. Audiences there watch more Japanese films and prefer them to American films, which is quite rare. Great in cinema. Now, people outside Japan don't tend to watch a lot of Japanese cinema. Well, or outside their, what was their imperial sphere of influence in the late 30s and 40s. So, you had a few major firms here who dominated at that time. After 1945, it's a real golden age. You see even more firms that are making a lot of films and important films. The Toho is it splits after a labor dispute. There's the Eastern Film Company in the top right there, Toei, and Nikatsu, which was had been a studio back in the 20s that's revived. A lot of film everywhere. When Japan breaks through to international audiences everywhere, but especially in the United States and Europe, it's Rashomon. This is the Japanese film that opens the floodgates. It's a younger director, Akira Kurosawa, who started making films in the 40s, and the studio and the head of the studio recognized that the historical film, especially with the martial arts angle, as you can see from the poster, but historical Japanese setting is something unique that's not out there. And also just incredibly sophisticated filmmaking from Kurosawa. This film is often shown in intro classes or narrative classes about flashbacks and how different people remember an event differently. Won at Venice and at the Academy Awards, Foreign Language Picture. Major success. And Kurosawa was the major Japanese filmmaker of the age. Mizoguchi as well went right alongside him because he's also making films in this historical genre, which is what Japan came to be known for in the 50s. Ugetsu in particular was successful. It has more fantasy elements, kind of ghost, which is fits with the setting of the time. But he's known for rather long takes and very long takes, and you can see the kind of beautiful composition from this still here. Mizoguchi, another major director. He's of an older generation, so he was making films in a number of different genres back in the 30s and sees international recognition at this time. Ozu is the third filmmaker I want to highlight. his he was not as well known internationally in the 50s, but is probably more well known internationally today. And that, one of the important critics was Paul Schrader, who's a screenwriter, for a bunch of Scorsese films and a filmmaker in his own right, had a book called Transcendental Style in Film in 1972 that highlights Ozu. And I want to focus on Late Spring, which is a story of a father and a daughter who's, I think she's in her late 20s, and the story is about how her aunt says, "Oh, it's time that she got married." Mother's not in the picture; she's passed away. So this daughter is taking care of her father and her father's household, but there's this sense from the aunt that society would say it's time for her to get married, to go out on her own. And this is a very interesting conflict because of what it means in terms of historical change. So this connection between the personal change that she's undergoing and the historical change. So Japan undergoing historical change from moving out of the imperial period. Japan now was an Axis power allied with Japan and Italy, was on the losing side of World War II. Heavily bombed, and especially the atomic bomb. So there's this kind of renewal period. It's changing away from the militarism of the 30s period. And so there's that historical change happening. There's also the general change of modernization. And what does that mean for women here? She's in her father's household, which is traditional, but she's also being asked to go, the pressure from her aunt is to go and move into with a new husband, which is also traditional. Whereas when she's with her father, she has a certain kind of independence and fits this kind of new woman figure. She says she's happy with the way things are, doesn't want to change, but there's these pressures that because she's a woman, that there's that she has to change. So it's a very rich story, both personally and the echoes that you can read into that about Japanese history. The screenwriter here and Ozu, Noda and Ozu, they worked as a team. Japanese studios were known for these cadres, or kind of director screenwriter units, and that within one studio would create kind of their own style and both visually and in storytelling. Ozu is known especially for having a low camera angle for moments that in the movie that are kind of empty in a way, where he'll just focus on some object that's there, and as if to kind of take us out of the story for a minute and put these people into a bigger context. There's a contemplative side to it that's definitely feels slow if you're used to action movies, but this has the richness of reading novels and of serious theater. So Late Spring, of course, the title is also this sense of the older maid. She's late in her the spring of blooming, if this is about childbearing and having children, or also the sense of the lateness in her father's life, and he hasn't thought to push her into a new family, to leave him. He's been content, but yet they've both been getting older. So I won't say anything more about this movie. It's very touching and one of the greatest. Now, many consider Tokyo Story, Ozu's Onoda's film of a few years later that stars many of the same actors, different characters. This Tokyo Story is a bit longer, even more rich, but similar to Late Spring. Now, the last thing I want to say about Japan is that it was not only the art film, of course, that became famous internationally, but Godzilla, monster film, as an example of kind of the popular genre that was successful and is often read. Well, I mean, the film says it's about the nuclear fears during the Cold War. And of course, during the Korean War, there was particular fear in Japan that more nuclear war would follow. Okay, so Japan, the most productive countries when it came to cinema, and the 50s was a period of great production and new international fame that Japan and its filmmakers had not known before. Okay. Now I want to talk about Eastern Bloc nations. So during the Cold War, the U.S. and the USSR, who had been allies during World War II, now they're not allies anymore. Now they're the enemies between the communists and the capitalists. Capitalists are the First World. This is the U.S. and the other allies, Great Britain, France, Western Germany, and so forth. Whereas the Second World is the USSR, the Soviet Union, which is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and a number of Eastern European nations that they had kind of occupied at the end of the war and installed communist governments that were sympathetic to the Soviets. So you had Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and East Germany. Some of those countries that had key that had important filmmaking going on there. And kind of to set the general context, Reconstruction is important here. A lot of devastation during the war, but the recovery is not as fast as it is in Western Europe, where the U.S. just pumped all kinds of money and goods through the Marshall Plan, as we saw. Marshall Plan, of course, does not extend to their enemy, Eastern Europe. So there's a kind of economic blockade, and it's slower recovery there. The other thing that affects cinema is that with a centralized government it's going to go through periods of political repression and then of opening up and liberalization. And during those opening up moments, you'll see a flourishing of the arts, and then it will be contracting with repression. Okay, let's step back to 30s. In Soviet Union, you have centralized state control of the industry. Stalin, who's this figure you see here, he's going to supervise it through various ministers, and one of the things that this does is it creates enormous bureaucracy in order to get things made. You have to get approval from all kinds of different people, and that slows the production of films. There's lots of films that are just not going to pass, or people are not going to even put things forward, because if they're not liked, there's a threat to your career and whatnot. What was the official style? That was socialist realism. So Chapayev, it's a Civil War story. the heroic everyday soldier. And in the 30s, it's much more about the everyday hero who's a role model for how to be. It's idealistic, no moral ambiguity. There's biopics. Eisenstein does a couple in the 30s, war stories. There's also musicals. There are tractor musicals about the farm collectivization. And all of those themes, I believe, continue into this period, except that in the 30s, the enemy would have been the fascists up until the pact with the Soviets in, was that 38? Now the kind of villain to criticize in the background is, of course, the USA and capitalist culture. So let me highlight one film from the thaw period of the 50s. So Stalin dies in 53. Khrushchev succeeds him, and after a couple of years, Khrushchev he starts this kind of de-Stalinization movement. He starts to openly criticize the cult of personality that had grown up around Stalin, that especially appeared in the cinema. You didn't even have everyday heroes. You had these kind of Stalin or Stalin-like kind of magical, idealized figures. And the cranes are flying it's set during World War II, I believe, but rather than focusing on a war hero, we're focusing on the home front. And rather than doing something heroic, it's a drama about adultery and the difficulty of being apart from your spouse and so forth. So it's a very successful film focusing on the individual rather than the collective, and the kind of real psychological, the feelings that people are dealing with, and a certain harder view. Individual feelings don't matter. Looking back, it isn't about the individual feelings, and you saw this in Vertov as well as the socialist realism. It's about the collective struggle and these bigger things going on. Well, we're returning a little bit to individual feelings here in this moment. That'll end in 1958 when there start to be some political upheavals in places like Czechoslovakia and Hungary. Poland as well is known for being a little more resistant to Moscow, and this shows up in their cinema in this period. Wajda's film Ashes and Diamonds, the most famous. It won the Critics' Prize at Venice, and this is not it takes place in 1945. It's right after the war ends. Again, not a war hero, but somebody who's in the underground and who's actually resisting the communists, resisting the Soviets, Allied soldiers in 1945. Of course, he dies in the end. He's this kind of doomed hero figure, but a great kind of anti-hero rebel. You could see from the glasses there, very stylish. The Polish school, one other thing that I'll mention about it, is known for being a little bit less centralized. That they like the cadre system in Japan, or you had other versions of this system earlier in France and elsewhere. They adopted this creative film unit system. So instead of a central producer that's controlling everything, you're going to have units with directors and screenwriters and actors that have a little bit more latitude to tell their own stories in their own style. Okay, so that was those are the Eastern Bloc countries. Now let's jump to China, which is, uh, going to become similarly allied to the Bolsheviks through the state socialism. Um, as you may know, there was a civil war that had begun in China in the 1930s. It was paused when the Japanese invaded in the late 30s, and everybody was just fighting the Japanese. But then, after 1945, when Japan is defeated, now the Civil War resumes, and eventually it's the Mao Zedong's Communist Party that triumphs in 1949, and the nationalists that were led by Chiang Kai-shek are going to go to the island of Taiwan. So this little historical background. As far as filmmaking companies, Shanghai had been the center during the 1930s. In the 40s, that returns. Now, Beijing is going to also come on the map and have an important, film schools and studios after 1949. There's going to be, some centralized state studio planning, but there, and eventually, then like 10 years later, there'll be some regional studios as well. But the companies, the big companies that had been around in Shanghai, kind of dissolve during the war. But then there are new companies. Some of them have the same, some of the same people in them that appear in the 40s. So two films that I want to mention: Spring in a Small Town, 1948. Not explicitly political, and maybe this is why a lot of people can easily get behind it as a great film. It's in the context of the Civil War, but or World War II rather, but it's about a love triangle, and you see the woman is. The female lead here is very affectionate toward male character who is now just a friend, but there's something more going on there. Another film I want to highlight because I am interested in sports movies is Woman Basketball Player Number 5. Now we're into the 50s, and this is this is again a period of liberalization, the kind of thaw that's called the Hundreds Flowers movement of 56, 57. It would be followed by Great Leap Forward, which is, going to be accompanied by a little bit more repressive atmosphere. But this film is in color. There's focus on youth culture, and it has. It's about a woman basketball player. You didn't see this in the U.S. at the time. One of the great points about socialist culture, and that would appear in their kind of state authorized media as well, was that you had racial integration and gender equality that you didn't have in the West. And this film is an interesting example of that. Okay. Now we're going to move to India. It is not does not have a communist regime, but it is not blockaded from the second world either. So now, the third world originally meant this non-allied movement. So you're not with the capitalists or the communists. You're independent. And what that meant for India was that their films would circulate. They didn't have the kind of trade barriers with the USSR and China, and so Indian films are very popular in China and the Soviet Union. A lot of people wanted to watch movies, all over Asia, and they couldn't get Hollywood movies, which was dominated in places like Latin America and Africa, I believe. So this is where Indian cinema would come in. Okay, a little bit of a quick history. British India had been a colony in the late 19th century up until 1947, and then here's the decolonization moment. It's partitioned into India and Pakistan and Bangladesh based on religion. Hindi dominant or non-Muslim, and then the Muslim areas of Pakistan and Bangladesh. So there are hundreds of languages and cultures in India, but Hindi becomes the dominant one, and production often happens in Hindi for that reason. It was originally centered in Bombay, now called Mumbai, but Bombay, Bollywood for is where that name comes from. The companies that had been production companies didn't survive so much into the 50s, but the exhibitors did, who owned the theater chain and the distributors, and so they got into production. And you start to see, rather than the more mythological and devotional subjects that were popular in the 30s, more contemporary subjects, and this formula of often known as the Bollywood formula emerges. Long, spectacular films with a romantic plot, a comic subplot, 6 songs, 3 dances, or more or less, and all of these things packed together in 2, 3 or more hour-long films. Playback singers appear at this time, so you have lip syncing, and everybody knows what's going on, and they become famous as well. One of the most famous films that I want to point out, and famous stars of the era, is Raj Kapoor. This film, Awara, 1951, is, I think, the most seen film across the globe in this era, especially, like I said before, in China and in the Eastern Bloc countries. Kapoor and his screenwriter Abbas have been compared to Chaplin in that their characters focus on the virtuous poor. But unlike Chaplin, he's making films in a very contemporary style. He's not long after he's going to turn to color. And there are some things about this film that are not exactly it's not like this film established the pure Bollywood formula. The formula was already there. Abbas and Kapoor are maybe taking it a different direction by focusing on the virtuous poor character rather than the pure glitz and glamour. All right. Last country to cover, Mexico. No good transition because we're totally on the other side of the globe now. And whereas before the war, Argentina would have been the dominant producer of Spanish language films in Latin America, because of Argentina's their neutrality during the war, they're going to kind of lose the support of the U.S. And U.S. companies backed by the state are going to shift that support to Mexico. So Mexico will become dominant in cinema and then later on in television and telenovelas. So this is a real golden age for Mexican cinema in the 40s and 50s. lot of collaborations with Hollywood. Talked about Emilio Fernandez in the early 40s. Maria Candelaria is a famous film. The most internationally successful film is Los Olvidados. It's presented as a juvenile delinquent film, as if this is kind of a sociological angle to study street gangs, these kind of orphaned kids that exist in every city at this time. And it starts out with a comparison to orphans everywhere. And there's both this sociological distance of understanding, how these influences of the, move from the main character who's in this kind of rough juvenile detention, then spread to the kids who are not living at home anymore, and how poverty is created all these kind of problems. But more interesting is the surrealism that the director Luis Buñuel brings to it. You may remember him from the famous surrealist film that he collaborated on with Salvador Dali, Un Chien Andalou. He's Spanish. He lived in France in the 20s and 30s, making avant-garde films. He goes to Mexico during the war, and there's some pushback. There's one famous moment where I think it's an egg that one of the characters throws at the camera, just to kind of throw it right in our face. Like, who do we think we are, looking down on these kids and trying to analyze them? So it's that give and take that are more interesting than just a pure sociological film. It won the Cannes. It won a prize at Cannes in 1951, and so it really marks it marks this era of great directors and artists. And Buñuel is an important figure in this because he stretches back to the 20s, when cinema first becomes seen as an art, and there's a revival of that's happening through the 50s and is really going to flourish when we get to talk about the 60s. Okay, so now we're at the end of this section. To summarize briefly, we're in Reconstruction again. It's happening more slowly in the Eastern Bloc countries, but cinema is important because it is the art of modernity. People who are living in the cities are going to the movies for entertainment. It's happening everywhere. It's already been happening in Japan for a long time, and that continues. It's happening with political independence in China, India, and other places. That the communist. We saw the communist-oriented countries that have this cycle of freeze and thaw, and when there's liberalization, there's more creative, artistic cinema that's happening. Well, that's another question. Is it only seen as creative and artistic from the West, according to their capitalist values? Interesting question to think about. But what you don't have here that you do in the US is television. Television is not yet on the scene as a competitor to cinema. And so cinema is thriving. It's really thriving in these places. And there are more films being made outside of the US and France and Western Europe than are being made inside it. A lot of the histories have been written from that perspective, and so that's why we started there, and now we're just kind of circling around the periphery. But if we were going to talk in terms of volume and the number of people watching movies and making movies, it really is where it's happening. So that is as much of an overview as we can do for nations East and South, 1945 to 1959.